In 2018, an American businessman cut a $70 million check for a single car. This wasn't some modern supercar with space-age tech, nor was it some futuristic electric prototype. It was a machine beaten into shape with hammers in a Maranello workshop over half a century ago, hand-formed from aluminum sheets, without a single blueprint for its bodywork. And the most bizarre part of this entire investigation is that the engineer who designed it was ruthlessly ousted from Ferrari before his creation ever touched a competitive racetrack. Today we dissect the Ferrari 250 GTO, the greatest sports homologation scam ever executed, the most valuable car on Earth, and a masterpiece born from an internal mutiny that nearly shattered the racing horse empire. To understand how this crisis unfolded, we must trace the evidence back to the autumn of 1961, when Scuderia Ferrari should have been celebrating its ultimate triumph. Their American driver, Phil Hill, had just secured the Formula One World Championship in the legendary Sharknose 156. Ferrari was also dominating endurance racing with the 250 Testarossa, conquering Le Mans, Sebring, and the Targa Florio. On paper, Maranello was the undisputed peak of motorsport. But internally, the company was a ticking time bomb. Tragedy had already fractured the team. At Monza, during that year's Italian Grand Prix, Hill's teammate, Count Wolfgang von Trips, who was actively fighting for the world title, died in a horrific crash that also claimed 15 spectators. Under Italian law, racetrack fatalities were treated as potential manslaughter, putting immense legal and public pressure directly onto Enzo Ferrari. But the real threat wasn't external. It was brewing inside the factory walls, driven by a name few dared to whisper aloud. Laura Garello, Enzo Ferrari's wife. Laura had lost her son Dino in 1956, taken by muscular dystrophy at just 24. That grief shattered their dynamics. Enzo retreated to his Modena office, increasingly isolated, consumed entirely by racing. Meanwhile, Laura began patrolling the Maranello factory floor like a hostile sovereign, directly interfering with critical engineering and technical decisions, alienating the staff and micromanaging every department. Girolamo Gardini, the sales manager, was the first to push back, issuing Enzo a blunt ultimatum: either Laura backed off or he resigned. Enzo reacted instantly, firing Gardini on the spot. But the founder failed to anticipate the catastrophic chain reaction that followed. 8 of Ferrari's most vital executives and engineers, including technical lead Carlo Chiti and sports car development head Giotto Bizzarini, alongside racing manager Romolo Tavoni, retained legal counsel and signed a joint letter protesting Enzo's executive decision. No one had ever challenged the ruler of Maranello so openly. It was a historic mutiny that Italian press later dubbed the Palace Revolt, a term evoking Renaissance coups that perfectly captured the high-stakes political drama unfolding within the company. Enzo's response was calculated and cold. He called the weekly meeting as usual, running it for exactly 45 minutes, without mentioning the protest letter. As the 8 rebels walked out, his secretary intercepted them, handing each a cash envelope with 1-month severance and showing them the door with orders never to return. In a single day, Ferrari had severed its entire intellectual core. The Vatican newspaper compared Enzo to the god Saturn, devouring his own children to retain absolute power. But the strategic damage went deeper. Bizzarini didn't leave empty-handed. He carried away the plans for the company's most vital development project, a new racing Berlinetta engineered specifically to crush the Jaguar E-Type and dominate the World GT Championship. Bizzarini had already tested a crude prototype in Pisa University's wind tunnel and at the Monza circuit, where Stirling Moss set unprecedented lap times for any 250 chassis. Yet the prototype was hideously unpolished, its raw aluminum skin scarred by hammer strikes and haphazardly bolted panels. Mechanics dubbed it the Monster, while the motoring press called it the Anteater. But beneath that ugly exterior lay a masterstroke of design, scientifically calculated aerodynamics, destined to reshape Grand Touring car development forever. And that revolutionary IP now belonged to a designer Enzo had just banished. The factory was left depleted of its engineering elite, holding a half-finished asset nobody knew how to complete, while British and American rivals closed in fast. The Jaguar E-Type was already on the market, captivating Europe. Across the Atlantic, Carroll Shelby was engineering his Cobra, leaving Maranello with zero internal expertise to salvage their flagship racing program. So Enzo Ferrari took the kind of high-stakes gamble he was famous for, betting everything on an unproven young talent. He summoned Mauro Forghieri, a 26-year-old engineer who had never managed a major project. He presented him with the ugly prototype and ordered him to complete it alongside Sergio Scaglietti, his trusted coach builder, operating a small workshop near the factory. At this critical juncture, the fate of the world's most legendary racing car rested with a novice engineer and a hammer-wielding craftsman. Sergio Scaglietti held no formal engineering degree or academic credentials. He was a self-taught metalworker who learned his trade repairing damaged bodywork in a modest Modena repair shop. Enzo Ferrari discovered him by chance, recognizing his raw talent. And from that point forward, Scaglietti had become the factory's trusted hand for shaping racing cars. But the task handed to him now was a massive strategic gamble unlike anything he had ever faced before. He had to salvage Bizzarrini's unfinished aerodynamic concepts and somehow sculpt them into a final race-ready body. And he had to do it without consulting the exiled designer himself. This is where our investigation reveals the most shocking detail. Scaglietti worked without blueprints, using zero-scale models or technical drawings, completely ignoring the precise millimeter-perfect drafting of rivals like Jaguar or Aston Martin. Instead, his raw method involved hammering sheets of aluminum directly onto the tubular steel chassis, shaping the metal panels piece by piece, guided solely by hand hammer and pure, unwritten, intuitive engineering. The most expensive car on Earth was literally beaten into existence, meaning every completed chassis possessed subtle, undeniable variations bearing the unique physical signature of the master craftsman who forged them. No two cars were truly identical, an engineering defect by modern standards that actually cemented this machine's legendary status. The result of Scaglietti's labor was a long, low-slung silhouette with a sharp nose that sliced through the air with unprecedented aerodynamic efficiency. The low hood sloped downward, punctuated by three distinctive D-shaped intakes carved into the nose, sealed with removable metal covers. This practical design allowed mechanics to instantly adjust radiator airflow on the track, depending on race day weather. Its flanks were clean and muscular, while the rear ended in an abrupt vertical chop, the famous cam tail design. A brilliant aerodynamic solution that Bizzarrini had refined in the Pisa wind tunnel to drastically slash high-speed drag. Underneath a completely flat undertray, managed airflow, a highly futuristic concept for the 60s that predated modern Formula One design by decades. Beneath that hand-shaped aluminum hood beat a V12 engine, representing the absolute peak of Maranello engineering. This was the legendary 60-degree V12, designed by Gioacchino Colombo, the brilliant mastermind, who had drafted Ferrari's very first engine back in 1947, tuned for the GTO. This motor came from the Testarossa race car, boasting nearly 3 liters of displacement and dry sump lubrication to survive high-speed lateral forces. 6 dual-choke Weber carburetors fed the beast with absolute precision, pushing total power output to 300 horsepower at a screaming 7,500 RPM. That was massive power for a car weighing under 950 kilograms, clad entirely in lightweight aluminum. Top speed eclipsed 280 kilometers per hour, while 0 to 100 took just over 6 seconds. Figures that in 1962 felt totally alien compared to any street-legal machine you could buy. But the strategic brilliance of this vehicle wasn't just its engine or its skin, it was how the components integrated. The frame was adapted from the short wheelbase 250 GT, but engineers used thinner-walled tubing to shave weight, added strategic bracing to maximize structural stiffness, and lowered the assembly to optimize the center of gravity. Stopping power came from state-of-the-art 4-wheel disc brakes, a critical technology that Ferrari had only recently pioneered on its road-going racers. They fitted a new 5-speed gearbox featuring Porsche synchronizers, a strategic upgrade that drastically improved shift speed and fluid dynamics compared to the old 4-speed unit. Inside, drivers found a harsh, uncompromising cockpit containing Spartan cloth-covered racing buckets, a classic 3-spoke wooden steering wheel, and stripped-back Veglia instrumentation including prominent tachometer redlining at 8,000 revolutions per minute. There was zero luxury here. Early chassis lacked even a basic speedometer, because who needs to track road speed when victory is the only metric? But then the program hit its biggest hurdle yet, one that nearly killed the project before it even reached the track. The official FIA rulebook was brutally clear. To race in the prestigious Group 3 class, Ferrari had to build at least 100 production models for public sale. 100 cars. Yet Ferrari would only construct 36 in total over the car's entire production run. How do you pass off 36 cars as 100? Enzo devised a loophole that was pure, audacious political theater. He skipped chassis numbers entirely in the production ledger, creating the illusion of a massive fleet of vehicles. When suspicious rival manufacturers loudly protested this deceptive math, Enzo calmly argued that the GTO was not a brand new model, but merely an evolution of the already homologated short-wheelbase 250 GT, bypassing the 100-unit requirement altogether. The fact that the race-spec GTO featured a 5-speed transmission and dry-sump lubrication unlike any street car was dismissed by Enzo as a minor detail. Legend even states that. When international inspectors arrived to count the inventory, Ferrari's team secretly shuttled the same cars between yards to fabricate the illusion of volume. Whether fact or myth, this story exposes the true genius of Enzo, a mastermind who bent regulations to his will as naturally as breathing. But a final barrier remained, making the 250 GTO even more exclusive than its tiny production run suggests. Wealth alone could not buy entry. Though the $18,000 price tag was astronomically high for the era, buyers still required personal vetting by Enzo himself or his highly protective and trusted North American distributor. We begin with Luigi Chinetti, an Italian-American mogul who ruled the crucial United States market with an iron fist. If Enzo did not deem you worthy, either because your racing pedigree was lacking or he simply disliked you, you were out. You could offer any fortune, but his response remained a flat refusal. The official debut occurred during the standard preseason press conference at Maranello in February 1962, where the GTO stood as the sole front-engine car displayed beside the new mid-engine prototypes. Analysts were immediately struck by body lines unlike anything they had ever witnessed. That low, sharp nose, the aggressively truncated tail, and a sheer sense of velocity radiating from the chassis even while parked in the courtyard. But the ultimate strategic test lay across the Atlantic under the harsh Florida sun at the grueling Sebring 12 Hours in March of that same year. Phil Hill should have been the happiest driver alive, ruling the motorsport world as the reigning Formula One champion. Instead, he was furious because management relegated him to the GTO in the Grand Touring class. This sat one tier below the elite prototypes built for outright speed. For a champion accustomed to chasing absolute victories, this step down looked suspiciously like a political punishment, and Hill knew Enzo's mind all too well. His contract for the upcoming 1962 Formula One season remained unsigned on Enzo's desk. Relations with Ferrari had soured after the Monza tragedy, making this demotion feel like a warning. Co-driving with him was the brilliant Belgian veteran Olivier Gendebien, an endurance racing master who had already secured multiple Le Mans and Sebring victories for the Italian brand. But what unfolded on the track shattered Hill's resentment, transforming how the entire paddock viewed this machine. The GTO proved so devastatingly competitive that it battled on equal terms with top-tier prototypes, purpose-built racing cars that on paper should have been completely untouchable. Hill and Gendebien crossed the finish line second overall, trailing only a purebred Ferrari 250 Testarossa, and dominating the GT class by an embarrassing margin. Hill was absolutely stunned by the strategic refinement of its handling. The flawless equilibrium of power and control and a telepathic steering response he had never before witnessed in a road-going sports car. At that moment, no one trackside realized they were witnessing the historic birth of what would become the most coveted classic car in history. From Sebring onward, the GTO launched into a devastating, relentless campaign of 3 consecutive years, seizing the International GT Manufacturers' Championship in 1962, 63, and 64. At the Tour de France Automobile, a brutal 10-day road race, combining hill climbs, specialized speed stages, and permanent racetracks, the GTO extended Ferrari's legendary dominance to an incredible 9 consecutive years. Across Europe, the story repeated with a predictability that humiliated their rivals. The GTO arrived conquered and moved on. The sleek Jaguar E-Type, which on paper posed the most serious strategic threat with its seductive styling and potent straight-six engine, proved far too mechanically fragile to survive grueling 24-hour endurance trials. It lacked the outright qualifying speed to challenge Ferrari on a single lap, and lacked the stamina to survive 12 or 24 hours of ruthless combat. Yet, while the GTO dominated global circuits, a personal vendetta was quietly brewing in the shadows, fueled by the bitter taste of corporate betrayal Giotto Bizzarini. The engineer exiled from Maranello during the Palace Revolt refused to simply watch the triumph of his own creation. After his firing, Bizzarini and Carlo Chiti allied themselves with Scuderia Serenissima, run by Count Giovanni Volpi, an incredibly wealthy Italian-Algerian aristocrat with a relentless passion for motorsport and the infinite capital to fund it. When Enzo discovered that Volpi had harbored his exiled rebellious engineers, his retribution was swift. He instantly canceled Volpi's pending GTO order, starving his rival's racing team of the era's most formidable weapon. This petty move provoked Bizzarini into designing something even faster than his original masterpiece. Using a short wheelbase 250 GT chassis, 2819 GT, bought through Gendebian himself, Bizzarini refined his original GTO design formulas to their absolute physical limits, shifting the engine lower and further back with dry sump lubrication. He shaved off over 60 kilograms compared to the stock GTO, wrapping it in a radical Piero Drogo body, whose flat tail spawned the nickname the bread van. Visually, it was polarizing, but aerodynamically brilliant. The ultimate strategic showdown arrived at the 1962 Le Mans 24 Hours. The lightweight, ultra-compact bread van launched into the race, instantly seizing the lead of the GT class, and humiliating Enzo's factory GTOs on the world stage. For 4 glorious hours, Bizzarini's design was winning his private war against the Titan of Maranello. Then suddenly, a broken drive shaft silenced the vehicle, stopping it dead. Count Volpi openly suspected foul play, hinting that saboteurs from Maranello had compromised the car before the green flag waved. While hard evidence remains elusive, this chilling doubt became one of motorsport history's darkest, most enduring conspiracies. Let's ask ourselves, who can truly say what transpired on that dark June night at La Sarthe? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a cold, calculating Texan with a gambler's heart was already engineering the weapon that would finally break Ferrari's stranglehold. Carroll Shelby, a veteran who won Le Mans in 1959, driving an Aston Martin, but a heart condition forced him out of the cockpit, compelling a strategic pivot into manufacturing. His strategy was simple yet brutal. Drop a massive American Ford V8 engine into a lightweight British AC chassis. This created an Anglo-American hybrid designed to challenge sophisticated European Grand Tourers through sheer American horsepower. The crude, wild Cobra was born, and by 1963, it was already disrupting Ferrari on American tracks. Early victories proved that raw Ford horsepower could easily offset a complete lack of aerodynamic refinement. Yet Shelby recognized a fatal strategic bottleneck. The open-top Cobra could never beat Ferrari in endurance races, where aerodynamic drag at sustained high speeds made the difference between winning and dropping out. They needed a closed coupe designed to slice through the air with GTO-level efficiency. This critical design task was handed to Pete Brock, a young designer working for Shelby, who consciously or not penned a silhouette that eerily mirrored the GTO itself. A long nose, a tapered tail, and a sharp, low-slung profile. Let's look closely at this. The Cobra Coupe was a declaration of war written in the enemy's language. The showdown arrived in 1964, the year Ferrari's strategy unraveled. At the Daytona, 2,000 kilometers, which would soon become the legendary 24-hour classic, the GTO triumphed once more. Phil Hill and Pedro Rodriguez drove chassis 5571 GT to an uncontested overall victory. The very first second series car redesigned by Pininfarina and built by Scaglietti. From a strategic standpoint, this machine deserves a closer look, representing Maranello's desperate attempt to keep an aging design competitive against a threat that grew more dangerous by the month. The body was wider and flatter than the original, featuring styling cues that echoed the mid-engine 250LM layout. Only 3 original examples were built, though 4 Series 1 cars were retrofitted with the new bodywork that very same year. This precise car chassis 5571 was the one Derek Hill, Phil's son, would pilot decades later, describing the experience as nothing short of pure ecstasy, with the V12 roar vibrating through every fiber of his body, and the shifter feeling like a billiard ball atop a tall, perfectly positioned lever. But at Le Mans in June 1964, the narrative shifted. 4 GTOs arrived on the grid with one clear strategic objective: destroy Shelby's Daytona Coupe. While Ferrari won overall with their prototype, the GT class witnessed a total collapse. The Cobras outpaced the GTOs to capture the class victory, proving that the Italian design had officially reached its developmental ceiling. The Cobra was faster down straights, leveraging superior American power and Brock's new aerodynamic bodywork, which finally leveled the playing field. The qualifying times spoke for themselves. The Daytona Coupe clocked 3 minutes and 56 seconds, while the fastest GTO failed to break 4 minutes and 3 seconds. A 7-second deficit on the Sartre circuit was a massive gulf that no amount of driver talent could bridge. Enzo Ferrari had anticipated this exact strategic threat, preparing his countermove, the 250LM. This mid-engine weapon was designed to replace the aging GTO, but history took a cruel turn when governing officials flatly refused to homologate the LM as a Grand Touring car, declaring it too far removed from production vehicles to qualify for Group 3. The master of loopholes, who had previously bypassed rules by building only 36 cars instead of 100, was now trapped by his own game, forced to rely on the obsolete GTO, desperately trying to squeeze the remaining speed from a platform that had already reached its absolute limit. As we watch the GTO fade on European circuits, the shockwaves of Ferrari's internal palace revolt triggered an earthquake that would reshape the Italian sports car market for decades. Enter Ferruccio Lamborghini, a wealthy industrialist who amassed a massive fortune building tractors. He owned several Ferraris and had frequently complained to Enzo about recurring clutch failures in his road cars. Enzo's dismissive legendary response was defensive and cutting, essentially telling him a tractor manufacturer lacked the expertise to critique a Ferrari. Deeply insulted, Lamborghini resolved to build his own Grand Tourer to prove his point. And who did he hire to engineer the power plant? None other than Giotto Bizzarini, the exiled Ferrari engineer who designed the V12 that powered the 350 GT, the Miura, the Countach, and virtually every Lamborghini for the next 30 years. The outcasts of the Palace Revolt returned to knock on the day. Commendatore's door, armed with a raging bull. By the close of 1964, the GTO was officially obsolete. Regulations shifted, mid-engine configurations conquered the racing world, and that front-engine Berlinetta, which had dominated for 3 straight years, could no longer keep pace with modern race cars. Yet here is the ultimate paradox you and I must consider. Just as the GTO lost its competitive edge on track, it began an unprecedented transition toward a status of immortality unmatched by any other vehicle. By the 1970s, the 36 surviving GTOs sat forgotten in dusty garages, dismissed as obsolete racing relics. Buyers acquired them for prices that now sound like a cruel financial joke, under $10,000, for a machine that half a century later would command $70 million. Collectors back then preferred investing in newer, flashy models, completely blind to the fact that these old racing Berlinettas would become the most coveted objects in automotive history. How did the market miscalculate this asset so colossally? Let's look closer. Back in the 1970s, the very concept of a collectible car simply did not exist in the form we know today. Back then, active racing machines were evaluated solely on their immediate track performance, not their potential historical significance. The shift occurred in the late 1970s as historic motor racing began to gain mainstream traction, and investors finally began to reevaluate the machines that had written the actual history of motorsport. The GTO, with its rare aesthetic appeal, extreme scarcity, and an unmatched Grand Touring racing record, quickly became the market's ultimate prize. Values skyrocketed at a dizzying pace throughout the 1980s, fueled by a speculative frenzy, inside a highly speculative classic car market. Then came the early 1990s market crash, and these vehicles lost a massive portion of their paper value, dropping to around $2.5 million by 1996. Yet even that sum, which sounded absolutely astronomical to the general public, was a strategic steal for anyone with the foresight to buy. From that point on, price charts moved in only one direction. In 2014, a 1963 model fetched $38 million at a Bonhams auction, setting a world record for a public auction sale. In 2018, the auction house R.M. Sotheby's traded chassis 3313 GT, the third production GTO ever built, for $48,400,000 following a 10-minute telephone bidding war, starting from a base of $35 million. That same year, a private transaction shocked the collecting world. Chassis 4153 GT, a silver and yellow model with a flawless racing pedigree, including the 1964 Tour de France victory, was acquired for $70 million. Purchased by David McNeil, an entrepreneur who built his fortune selling automotive floor mats. Who would think floor mats could fund the most expensive vehicle in history? The 20th century GTO ownership registry reads like an elite directory of global wealth and celebrity. Pink Floyd drummer Nick Mason owns one, actively driving it at vintage racing events. Ralph Lauren, the American fashion icon, preserves another in his legendary collection. Yet the most astounding historical detail is that all 36 original GTOs survive today, each possessing its own distinct documented lineage, wearing its own racing scars and harboring its own secrets. No other limited-run vehicle in history boasts a 100% survival rate. This fact alone secures the GTO as an anomaly. But what became of the men who actually engineered this legend? Their ultimate fates diverged sharply. Mauro Forghieri, the young talent Enzo Ferrari trusted with the crisis-stricken project, went on to become a premier Formula One engineer, designing the legendary single-seaters that carried Niki Lauda to world championship titles. Carroll Shelby won his strategic battle against Ferrari with the Cobra, but that triumph proved short-lived. The Ford GT40 replaced the Cobra in Henry Ford's scheme to humiliate Enzo Ferrari at Le Mans, leaving Shelby's small firm without the resources to compete long-term. Bizzarini, the Revolt genius who designed the GTO and later the Lamborghini V12, attempted to launch his own car company, but was swindled by investors, ending in bankruptcy in 1968. Forced to teach engineering at the University of Pisa in the very building where he once wind tunnel tested the GTO prototype. And Enzo Ferrari, the autocratic commander whose mass firing had triggered this entire chain reaction, was forced in 1969 to sell 50% of his firm to Fiat to survive mounting debt. The king of Maranello surrendered half his empire to the king of Turin. Yet the 250 GTO remains the ultimate symbol of that era, when racing machines were beaten into shape by hand without blueprints, and builders bypassed international regulations by randomly numbering chassis. And when a champion driver felt penalized for being assigned the vehicle destined to become the most valuable asset on Earth. This machine was born from corporate mutiny, then sculpted in the workshop of a brilliant coach builder. It dominated global racing for 3 seasons, triggered the creation of its fiercest rival, and today commands a price far higher than fine art masterpieces. When you and I study this, we realize that history's greatest masterpieces often emerge from the deepest crises. If this historical investigation intrigued you, please hit like, share your favorite classic Ferrari in the comments, and subscribe so we can continue analyzing the machines and strategies that changed the world.